Hello. Thank you so much for dropping by this video. I was deeply involved in the work of Byron Katie. I went to a lot of retreats with her. I practiced the work quite a bit. I actually started to teach it to other people. And I feel it's my duty, given that I taught it to people, to share some of what I am very convinced are some very serious problems with it. So, in essence, this is kind of a living amends to, uh, well, I'll say more as I go along. So, first and foremost, um, one of the essential problems with the work of Byron Katie, and I'm going to speak at it for a moment from the position of Advaita Vedanta, the Indian tradition of non duality, is that there aren't preparatory practices. So, here in the West, we love to be like, oh, everything's one, or let go of your ego, or, just surrender all your preferences. But the thing is that those ideas and specifically the practices which lead you to the living embodiment of such ideas, they're actually just not taught to the general public. In traditional Advaita, it's a very systematic. You're very prepared before such ideas are thrown your way, that you're introduced to such ideas, much less practices that are about transcending the ego. Whereas in the work starts right with it. And that's one of the key problems is, as someone who struggles with codependence and someone who struggles with PTSD, what the work did is it led me to dissociate, literally to dissociate from my feelings and preferences. Byron Katie sums up the work as loving what is. Now that's fine if you're loving what is means loving everything, accepting everything. And that's okay if you're a saint. A great Advaita Vedanta master was one day beat up and then taken, his students came and found him and took him back, and they're like putting ointment on his body and taking care of him. And they're like, oh, master, we're so sorry. You're beat up. Those people who beat you up were awful. And the Advaita sage just laughed, and he said, I don't feel any difference between the hands that are taking care of my body and the hands that punched me and beat me up. Now, if you're at that level of detachment, then yes, loving what is wise. If you're not at that level of detachment, or not necessarily at that level, but to a place of real detachment and real dispassion and a very balanced, integrated personality, something like the work of Byron Katie, or I've talked a lot on this channel, self-inquiry, it will destabilize and mess you up big time. That's so I can say that with utter clarity about Advaita Vedanta, having studied it, and then looking at the work of Byron Katie from the perspective of Advaita Vedanta, not just studied Advaita, but practiced it, the same principle applies. And that was my experience with the work, is it really destabilized me, and I was doing hours of it a day. One of the other huge problems is, it's so, the work never really shifted anything for me. It would temporarily relieve my suffering. And see, Advaita Vedanta speaks to this as well. People who practice self-inquiry in Advaita Vedanta but haven't done the preparatory practices, all self-inquiry does is it gives you a temporary high. It gives you a temporary release from your ego. And I can honestly say, having done, hundreds and hundreds, I don't even know, probably I could easily say I've done 1,000 hours of Byron Katie's self-inquiry, both in retreat and on my own, and inquired on hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of. Fundamentally, nothing changed. There was one belief that changed, the belief that I was broken beyond repair. I had to inquire about 6 times on that, And then that did shift. And then a couple of years later, it came back. So any promise that Byron Katie or that any such people make about permanent shifts, it's not my experience. It's not my experience at all. And I know someone who was a former trainer. She's very high up in the Byron Katie. Well, can I say very high up? Somewhat high up in the Byron Katie organization, and doing it for a long time. Just fundamentally still depressed, still neurotic, still struggling with a lot, and had made some improvement for sure. But this promise, and that's part of my big problem and place where I went wrong. There's this promotion like the work will solve everything. It wasn't my experience. It wasn't this person's experience, who I know quite well. And she was in it for a very long time. And again, actually part of the organization. And this promise of like the work will take care of everything. Well, if your mind is properly prepared, I bet it would. But none of that is offered. And of course, there's the price tag. Last time, right now the retreats aren't happening, but her 9-day retreat was, last time I checked, it was over $6,000. And so right there, that's just a red flag. That's not even a yellow flag. That's a red flag. Something like that can't lead to liberation. And in my view, someone who charges that amount of money is not liberated. It's just a clear sign. She also had a 28-day course that was not course, but retreat, $20,000. So the whole money thing, and then you combine the money thing with this promise of the work will solve all problems. Now, with that said, it's an amazing self-help technique. It's an amazing, I think very highly of it as that. It's definitely not in and of itself, not a path to liberation. For someone who's very integrated and already had a profound experience, awakening experience, it could be a great way to sort of clean up the scraps. I feel like there's one other thing I wanted to say. The most insidious thing about the work is it's not open to criticism. When any sort of criticisms are put to the work responds by just saying, is it true? I've seen Byron, I've seen Katie do it to people directly. I've seen it on the website. There's this idea that the work, it's kind of like, in a religious sense of the word, like, there's certain aspects of a religion that you're just not allowed to question. Like, this is true. And the work has some of that built into it. Like the work works is basically, and the work will work for everything. And the work will lead you to freedom. Those are some of the things that are just not, you're just, in essence, you're not allowed to question those things. And the thing is with Byron Katie and with most modern spiritual teachers is they've kind of created this path. Not kind of, they've created a path. And untested, untried, obviously it gave them some benefit, hopefully. But see, even with the work, Byron Katie said that the work is a verbal she said that she had a spontaneous awakening experience. And then when negative thoughts, and all her negative thoughts left, and when the negative thoughts came back, she said something within her arose and met those negative thoughts. And that the work is a verbal expression of what that inner wisdom was that arose within her. So even right there, she's not teaching what she did. She didn't do it. She had this awakening, and then this wisdom would arise and just meet it. And it's also highly systematized, which on the surface sounds nice, but it's, I've watched it become more and more rigid and structured over the years. The first time I was introduced to it was 1999. 99. And I've watched it get more and more like structure and codified. The last live experience I had with Byron Katie was 2016, I think 17, 2017, 2000. And it's just become more and more rigid in certain ways. And so again, I'm not saying it's all bad, but it's definitely, in my view, based on everything I know from Advaita Vedanta and my own experience of it, it's definitely not a path to liberation. And Byron Katie had a profound awakening, but she didn't have that awakening through the work. She had a spontaneous awakening, and then she created the work based on some of her. It's more like inspired by some of her experiences. So the beautiful thing about the work is you can learn to do it without paying any money. And but to anyone who's highly codependent, who has an unstable personality, I would absolutely advise against it. It just doesn't have a true spiritual path. Has a foundation and generally has it sort of it builds you up before it tears you down, and the work just starts tearing you down. And last thing I'll say, Byron Katie's a cool woman. I've been to a lot of these retreats, and I've had a lot of one-on-one talks with her. You can see the light in her eyes. She radiates Shaktipat like no other teacher I've ever met. It pumps out of her. She's a force of nature, and I don't know, force of nature. She's just a powerful being, and funny and intelligent, and so I have respect for her as a yogi, but I don't have respect for her as a guru. I don't see her as a guru. I certainly tried that out, and it didn't work for me. And having explored traditional Advaita Vedanta, I can say with clarity that she's not a liberated being from the perspective of Advaita Vedanta, and definitely not a guru, but a self-help teacher, certainly, and someone teaching on spiritual themes, certainly. And but she's also a businesswoman, and the amount that she charges for her workshops shows that. And the last thing, this is one of the hardest things. She's very likable. She's very charming, very charismatic. Now, and this is where discernment needs to come in, and that can be a yellow flag. If you find yourself just adoring someone, that can be true devotion, but it can also be an indicator of something else. And so thank you so much for joining in. I hope this is helpful to people. Asking the question, is it true of any thought? Very powerful. Very, very powerful. Ultimately, that's where we want to get to is the point where we're checking each thought. But her system, it's like you take one thought and you spend 15 minutes on it. Ramana Maharshi actually spoke against that. He said that won't lead to liberation. I think maybe that's my final point. According to Ramana Maharshi, you can't examine each thought. That's not going to lead to liberation. He was crystal clear on that. I wish I'd kind of started with that point, but I'll end with it. So thank you so much for joining in. Take care. Much love.